Divisive and not healing was the erection of monuments that were not necessarily erected immediately following the Civil War, but were erected in direct defiance of individuals who were enslaved. They were erected as symbols of hatred. They were erected as symbols of Jim Crow. They were erected as symbols of defiance. They were erected at a time when, in the 1950s, I can't do this.
What purpose does the senior senator from Richmond City, Senator McClellan, rise?
Thank you, Mr. President. I think you all are witnessing the pain that some of these monuments inflicted on Virginia's Black community when they were put up. Many of them were put up right after Reconstruction as part of a lost cause narrative and a backlash to the social, economic, and political rise of the Black community. Others were put up in response to the Brown versus Board as part of the massive resistance movement. If you haven't, and I tried to pull it up and couldn't do it fast enough, I invite you to read the editorial written by John Mitchell in the Richmond Afro-American when the Robert E. Lee statue on Monument Avenue was put up. It was very clear to the Richmond African American community that that was more than just honoring a soldier and a veteran and those who died during the war. It was the beginning of a narrative that was used by some to put Blacks back in their place. And many of these monuments continue to cause that pain. And the decision about what to do with those monuments, whether to put them in context, whether to move them, whether to take them down, should be in the communities where those monuments are. Not here, just in Richmond. Part of what happened when this law was first amended to prohibit any monument, regardless of when it was built, from being moved, modified, or basically touched in any way. And that bill was vetoed. There was a work group that was put together. The only thing everyone as a part of that work group could agree on was that this is a very difficult but necessary conversation. If Virginia is ever going to heal from the trauma that occurred beginning 400 years ago, if we're ever going to heal like any family, we have to talk about that trauma, how it affected everyone, how it continues to affect everyone, how it continues to fester until it blows up in Charlottesville. Because when you don't talk about trauma, it doesn't go away. It simmers until it can't be held back anymore. And what that working group said was these need to be conversations in the community where people can have an honest conversation about perspectives that aren't theirs. If we don't do this now, when are we going to do it? When are we going to have that conversation, and when are we going to heal as a Commonwealth? Because I'm going to tell you what, my father, my mother, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, my great-great-grandparents, and I don't know who before them, because when they were born, somebody didn't deem to put their name on a piece of paper. But everybody in my family, and Senator Sproul's family, and Senator Lucas's family, and Senator Locke's family has a story about the trauma inflicted on them solely because of the color of their skin. And these monuments, some of these monuments, trigger that trauma for every single one of us. We can't ignore that. We cannot ignore that. We need to begin the healing process, and ignoring this conversation or simply having it in the floor of the Senate or the floor of the House is not going to do it. I ask that you pass this bill.
Senator Locke, rise.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think I'm okay now.
Senator's the floor.
Okay. I think that it's okay to teach tolerance, but I don't think it's okay to teach revisionist history. And I think when I spoke about this bill in the local government committee, one of the things I talked about was my own dream of becoming the archivist of the United States. That was my original goal, and I know some of you probably wish that I had become that. Instead of standing here. But for a short time prior to going into higher education, I did work as an archivist. I worked as an archivist in a state archives. And every day in that state archives, I had to walk by these monuments at the state archives. Every day. Walking by these monuments. I celebrated Jefferson Davis's birthday as a state holiday. I celebrated Confederate History Month every year. I celebrated Confederate Day every month. I celebrated Robert E. Lee's birthday every year as a state holiday, being paid state wages, celebrating those days, to the point that my tolerance level evaporated, and I quit the job. I quit the job and moved on to another job at an archives in Atlanta, where somehow in Atlanta history stopped for them in 1960. In Atlanta, Georgia, which was a bastion of the civil rights movement, where Martin Luther King was born, where they didn't even have anything in that institution about Martin Luther King, where they dedicated everything to Gone with the Wind, which was fictional. And you would have thought that Scarlett O'Hara was real in that institution. So I had had enough of revisionist history. So my dreams of wanting to become the archivist of the United States died in Atlanta, Georgia, where they too wanted to relive the lost cause. So I decided to finish my doctorate and go into higher ed, where I could teach about the reality of what life is really like. Several years ago, I visited Ghana, and went to Elmira Castle, which was not really a castle, it was a slaveholding pen, and stood in the door of no return, looking out on the Atlantic Ocean. And as I looked out, I thought to myself that there were ships coming through, going to and from that slaveholding pen, with many Africans down in that hold who traveled the Middle Passage, some to the Caribbean, some to the shores of what would become the United States of America. And I said to myself that maybe one or two ancestors of mine may have been on one of those ships. But I also said to myself, at the very least, that ancestor survived. Not only did that ancestor survive that Middle Passage, that ancestor survived the horrors of slavery. That ancestor survived the horrors of Jim Crow. That ancestor survived the horrors of segregation. That ancestor allowed me to survive the horrors of walking by those stupid monuments that had been erected for a lost cause, so that I could stand here and say to you that those monuments and statues were not erected to talk about the reality of a history. They were erected to say to me, to Jennifer McClellan, to Lionel Spruill, and to Louise Lucas, to you, Mr. President, that your lives don't really matter to me. That you were the reason why we're erecting these, to remind you every single day that your life don't really matter to me. That you were the reason why we fought this war. And that you don't matter. But let me tell you the real reason for this bill is to give local governments an option of what they are to do about this. Not the state. That's the reason for the bill, is to give local governments the option, not us here. Thank you, Mr. President.